September 11, 1973, Santiago, Chile. Tanks roll through the streets, fighter jets scream overhead. Smoke rises from the presidential palace. Inside, Salvador Allende is making his last radio broadcast, a pistol on the desk beside the microphone. And 3 miles away, in a windowless basement beneath a government communications building, soldiers kick open a reinforced door to a room that looks like it fell out of a science fiction film. 7 white fiberglass chairs arranged in a perfect circle. No desks, no keyboards, no paper anywhere. Screens embedded in the curved walls displaying real-time data from every factory in Chile. Steel production in the north, copper output in the Atacama, textile flow in Valparaiso. Buttons built into the wide armrests so that workers, not bureaucrats, not generals, not economists with degrees, could make decisions about the national economy with a single press. The soldiers stare at it. Then they smash it to pieces. That room was the operations room of Project Cybersyn. And here is the part that most history books leave out entirely. The system it controlled had already proven it worked. Not in theory, not in a university simulation. In the middle of a genuine national emergency, it kept an entire country fed while the roads were shut down and the supply chain was collapsing. But Cybersyn is only the beginning. Because across 3 decades and 3 continents, governments and engineers built systems that could have given us the internet, artificial intelligence, digital democracy, and networked education a full generation before Silicon Valley claimed to invent them. Every single one was strangled. Not by technical failure, not by scientific impossibility, by the people who had the most to lose if the systems succeeded. These are not speculative designs buried in academic papers. These are machines that ran, networks that connected cities, software that predicted crises before they arrived. And the story of how all of them were erased is more disturbing than the technology itself. Rewind 12 years, 1961, Moscow. A mathematician walks into a government building with rolls of diagrams under his arm, and a proposal that will either transform the Soviet Union or end his career. His name is Viktor Glushkov, a Ukrainian cybernetics pioneer who directs the Institute of Cybernetics in Kyiv. He is 48 years old, chain-smokes filterless cigarettes, and possesses the kind of conviction that makes bureaucrats nervous. His idea is breathtaking in scope. Connect every factory, every warehouse, every ministry in the Soviet Union into a single real-time computer network. 20,000 terminals, 3 tiers of processing, local, regional, central. Data flowing from shop floors to planners at the speed of electricity. Not weekly reports, not monthly summaries, live data, pulsing through copper wire like a national heartbeat. He calls it OGAS, the All-State Automated System. In 1962, Glushkov goes further. He proposes eliminating paper money entirely and replacing it with electronic payments. 1962, 37 years before PayPal, 47 years before Bitcoin. A Soviet mathematician in a wool suit is sketching the architecture of a cashless economy on a chalkboard in Kyiv, while American banks are still processing checks by hand. The Central Intelligence Agency does not find this funny. A declassified assessment from that year describes OGAS as a serious threat, a system that, if implemented, could give the planned economy computational advantages the West could not match. The Americans understood the implications before the Soviets did. So what killed it? Not the Americans, not technical limitations, the Soviet Ministry of Finance. Glushkov needed 100 billion rubles. The ministry refused. Not because the money did not exist, because OGAS would have made the economy transparent. Every ruble tracked, every inefficiency visible, every minister's private fiefdom exposed to data. Benjamin Peters, a media historian at the University of Tulsa, spent years excavating this story for his book, How Not to Network a Nation. His conclusion is devastating. The first country to conceive a national internet killed it because transparency threatened the people in charge of approving the budget. Glushkov spent the rest of his life trying to revive the project. He submitted revised proposals, he wrote letters, he lobbied. By the late 70s, according to colleagues interviewed by Peters, Glushkov had begun to suspect that foreign agents inside the Politburo were actively sabotaging his work. He calculated that without OGAS, by 1980 the entire population of the Soviet Union would need to be employed in economic planning just to keep the system running. He was not far off. The Soviet economy collapsed 11 years later. The funding was denied. The proposal was shelved. The architect died in 1982, still believing his country had been stolen from itself. Now back to Chile. Because the room that was smashed in Santiago did not appear out of nowhere. It was designed by a man whose brain operated on a frequency most institutions could not tolerate. Stafford Beer was a British management cybernetician, a theorist who believed that organizations, like living organisms, could be modeled as nervous systems. In 1971, the newly elected government of Salvador Allende invited Beer to do something no government had ever attempted: wire an entire national economy into a single decision support network. Beer said yes within days. He packed a suitcase and flew to Santiago. The system he built was called Cybersyn. Its nerve center was the operations room, the ops room. Designed by a German interface specialist named Guy Bonsiepe, the room looked like nothing that existed anywhere on Earth in 1972. The walls were dark. The lighting was low. 7 tulip-shaped fiberglass chairs sat in a circle, white against the black floor. No desks, no paper, no keyboards. Buttons studded the wide armrests, each one connected to a different data stream. The walls displayed geometric visualizations fed by a national telex network. If you sat in one of those chairs, you could see the entire Chilean economy breathing in front of you. The network used existing telex machines, roughly 500 of them, scattered across factories from the Atacama Desert to Patagonia, to transmit production data daily. The software processed it using Bayesian forecasting models written on an International Business Machines 360/50 mainframe. Eden Medina, a historian of technology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, documented the full architecture in her book, Cybernetic Revolutionaries. And then came the proof. In October 1972, opposition truckers launched a nationwide strike designed to choke the economy. The roads shut down. Supply chains fractured. The country should have starved. It did not. Cybersyn rerouted food distribution through its telex network in real time, identifying which warehouses had surplus and which regions faced shortages. The government survived the strike. The system worked. 11 months later, General Augusto Pinochet's military seized power. Allende died in the presidential palace. And the ops room, that strange, beautiful, impossible room, was physically demolished. The chairs were broken, the screens pulled from the walls. The network went dark. Beer fled Chile with nothing but a suitcase and his notebooks. He spent the rest of his life in a small stone cottage in rural Wales, drawing mandalas, growing vegetables, and grieving what he called the most important work he had ever done. He never fully recovered. The prototype that proved a small country could run its economy through collective intelligence was not archived. It was not studied. It was not even photographed. It was destroyed by men who understood exactly what it threatened and exactly how little force was required to end it. I have spent weeks inside the technical documentation of these projects, and the pattern that keeps emerging is not conspiracy. It is something quieter and more corrosive. The people who killed these systems were not villains. They were managers protecting their desks, ministers protecting their budgets, generals protecting their hierarchies. The technology threatened no one's life. It threatened everyone's position. But Beer was not finished with Chile. Before the coup, he had been working on something even more radical than Cybersyn, a device that would have turned every Chilean household into a node in a national feedback loop. He called it Cyberfolk. The concept was disarmingly simple: a small device in each home, about the size of a transistor radio connected to the telex network. It had a dial that allowed citizens to register their satisfaction or dissatisfaction with government policy in real time. Not a vote, not a survey, not a focus group conducted once every 4 years. A continuous signal, flowing from living rooms and kitchens into a central aggregation system, displayed as a real-time graph on a panel in the ops room. Beer described it as the scientific equivalent of applause, a way for a government to hear its people continuously, without the distortion of elections, polls, or media interpretation. The design specifications survive in his book, Platform for Change. The schematics show a device elegant in its simplicity: a few transistors, a dial, and a connection to the existing telex infrastructure. It could have been produced cheaply. It could have been deployed within months. The meters were never mass-produced. Components were scarce in Allende's Chile, which was already under economic embargo. The military coup made the question academic. The prototypes were destroyed alongside everything else. But here is the thought that will not leave me alone. Beer designed a continuous democracy feedback device in 1972. 50 years later, the closest equivalent we have is a like button owned by a private corporation. And the like button does not feed a public dashboard visible to citizens. It feeds an advertising algorithm invisible to everyone except shareholders. Whether Cyberfolk would have become a tool of liberation or surveillance is a genuine open question. Beer himself worried about it constantly. He wrote that if the feedback loop were implemented without full transparency, if the data flowed upward but the results were not shared back downward, the device could become the most efficient instrument of tyranny ever conceived. The ethical dilemma was not a bug discovered later. It was designed into the architecture from the start. We never got to find out which way it would break, because the architecture was smashed along with everything else in that basement on September 11th. Leave Santiago behind, cross the equator, cross the Atlantic, and land in a basement of a different kind. A computer lab at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. Because while Chile was building a national nervous system and the Soviet Union was failing to build one, a team in the American Midwest quietly built something that contained the embryo of nearly everything we now call the Internet. It was called PLATO, Programmed Logic for Automatic Teaching Operations. And to describe it as an educational platform is like describing the Apollo program as a flight test. In 1960, a physicist named Donald Bitzer, at the university's Computer-Based Education Research Laboratory, began designing a system for computer-assisted learning. By 1964, Bitzer had a problem. Existing cathode ray monitors flickered too badly for sustained reading. Students got headaches. Concentration crumbled after 20 minutes. So instead of accepting the limitation, Bitzer invented a new kind of screen. An orange gas plasma display panel, the first flat panel screen in history. He built it specifically for PLATO because no adequate screen existed. The panel glowed amber. It was thin. It was sharp. It did not flicker. And it would not appear in consumer electronics for another 30 years. By the early 70s, PLATO terminals had touchscreens. Not primitive pressure-sensitive overlays, infrared grid touchscreens that could detect a finger position with precision. Users tapped the warm orange plasma surface to navigate lessons, answer questions, and interact with simulations. The glass was always slightly warm to the touch because of the gas discharge behind it. On these terminals, students built the first role-playing games, the first flight simulators, the first multiplayer online environments, and something else, something that would not reach the mainstream until the late 1990s. Forums, message boards, instant messaging, personal profiles, online communities that developed their own cultures, their own slang, their own social hierarchies. All of it running on PLATO in 1973, 2 full decades before the World Wide Web existed. Remember how Glushkov imagined 20,000 terminals connecting the Soviet Union? PLATO actually built the ecosystem. Over 1,000 terminals at its peak, spread across universities and military installations, running simultaneously on a single mainframe. The difference? Nobody in power was afraid of what students might do with it. Not at first. The platform operated for over 3 decades. But it was locked inside an expensive mainframe ecosystem owned by Controlled Data Corporation, which charged institutions steep fees for access. When cheap personal computers flooded the market in the 1980s, PLATO could not compete on price. The system that contained the seed of every social network, every e-learning platform, every chat application on your phone today was priced out of existence by machines that could do less but cost a fraction. And then it gets stranger. Many of the engineers who went on to work at Xerox PARC, the legendary lab that produced the graphical user interface, the mouse, the desktop metaphor that Steve Jobs famously saw and adapted for the Macintosh, had spent formative years on PLATO first. Brian Deere, who documented the system's full history in The Friendly Orange Glow, traced the intellectual lineage directly. The Windows, The icons. The idea that a computer screen should look like a workspace rather than a command line. These concepts circulated on PLATO before they appeared anywhere else. The interfaces that defined personal computing did not emerge from nothing. They emerged from a system almost nobody remembers, and the people who profited from them never sent a thank you note. One floor below the PLATO terminals, something even stranger was happening. A programmer named Doug Brown and his colleague David Woolley had built an application called Talkomatic. The year was 1973. The concept was simple and electrifying. A screen divided into 5 horizontal bands, each one glowing that distinctive PLATO orange. Each band belonged to a different user, and as you typed, every other user saw your words appear letter by letter in real time. Not after you pressed enter, not after a server processed your message, as your fingers hit the keys. If you paused to think, the other 4 people in the room watched your cursor blink. If you made a typo and backspaced, they saw that too. This is what we now call a typing indicator, the feature that shows you 3 pulsing dots in a modern chat window. Except in 1973, it was not 3 dots. It was the actual text, streaming live. The sensation, according to people who used it, was closer to being in the same room than anything the internet would produce for the next 30 years. Talkomatic was so addictive that the university administration attempted to shut it down, calling it a waste of mainframe computing power. Students were spending hours in conversation instead of completing coursework. Late at night, the 5-channel chat rooms filled with debates, jokes, confessions, and the kind of free-form human contact that would later define social media. The administration treated it as a bug in the educational system. It was a preview of the 21st century. When the internet emerged in the 1990s, the typing indicator vanished. Bandwidth was too expensive. Messages were sent in blocks, not streams. The most human feature of digital communication, the feeling of watching someone think, was sacrificed for efficiency. It took nearly 40 years to get it back. And when it returned, it came as a novelty. While programmers at Illinois were inventing social media 2 decades early, one engineer in the same building was doing something even less expected. He was teaching deaf children to hear music. Sherwin Gooch, a researcher at the Computer-Based Education Research Laboratory, designed the Gooch cybernetic synthesizer for the PLATO 5 terminal in 1972. It was the world's first 16-voice programmable digital synthesizer connected to a computer network. The central mainframe could send audio commands to any terminal across the entire PLATO system, generating complex tones, chords, and sequences remotely. One machine in Urbana-Champaign could make a terminal in Minneapolis sing. The specifications put it roughly 15 years ahead of consumer sound technology. The Sound Blaster card, the device that revolutionized personal computer audio when it launched in 1989, could produce 11 voices. Gooch's synthesizer produced 16 in 1972. Running through a terminal that also had a touchscreen and an orange plasma display. The future was sitting in a university basement, and the consumer market would not catch up for a generation. But the application that mattered most was not entertainment, it was education. Gooch used the synthesizer to create programs that translated sound into visual patterns on the warm orange plasma screen. Deaf students could see the shape of a note, its attack, its sustain, its decay, rendered as moving geometry. They could see the difference between harmony and dissonance. They could interact with music through a sense they had always been told was unavailable to them. For the first time, a deaf child could compose a chord and watch it bloom across a screen in real time. The technical documentation survives in Audio Engineering Society historical archives and PLATO terminal research papers. The exact number of synthesizer modules produced remains disputed. Some sources say fewer than 100. What is not disputed is that the technology died with the platform. No commercial version was ever manufactured. No successor was built. No music education program for deaf students replicated what Gooch had demonstrated. The sound vanished, along with the glow of the orange screens, and with it, a proof of concept that music education could be liberated from hearing itself. 6,000 miles east, Moscow, 1971. Glushkov is not done. The rejection of OGAS did not stop the Soviet government from trying again. But this time, the approach was decentralized. The 24th Congress of the Communist Party approved the creation of EGSVT, the Unified State Computer Network. The resolution passed with enthusiasm. On paper, it was everything OGAS should have been. A national digital infrastructure connecting ministries, factories, and research institutes under a single standard. In practice, it was sabotage by committee. Each ministry, instead of adopting a shared protocol, built its own incompatible system. The Ministry of Defense encrypted everything and shared nothing. The Ministry of Agriculture ordered terminals from one manufacturer. The Ministry of Heavy Industry ordered from another. The Ministry of Light Industry built a proprietary format that could not communicate with either. The network fractured into dozens of isolated digital islands, each one a tiny kingdom with its own data format, its own budget, and its own refusal to cooperate. Glushkov, watching this unfold from Kiev with growing fury, reportedly wrote that the socialists were behaving like the worst capitalists, hoarding resources and fighting over budgets instead of building something that served the whole. Peters documented the internal memos in detail. The language is bitter, precise, and prophetic. Glushkov saw exactly where this would lead. Nobody listened. Here is what I find most revealing, and I have turned this over in my head for longer than is probably healthy. The Americans killed their competition through markets. The Soviets killed theirs through meetings. The result was identical. No national network, no shared standard, no digital future. Two superpowers, two different ideologies, two identical failures. The common factor was not capitalism or communism. It was human beings in positions of authority who could not tolerate a system that made their authority visible. The PLATO system did not just host games and chat rooms. It ran on a language so unusual that its death remains one of the strangest episodes in computing history. Tutor was built in the 1960s specifically for people who were not programmers, teachers, instructors, subject experts with no engineering background. A biology professor who had never written a line of code could create a complex interactive lesson, with branching paths, animated diagrams, and scored assessments, using commands that read almost like English. The language had a built-in answer judging system that understood context and could forgive typos. In the 1960s, decades before autocorrect existed. If a student typed Michelangelo instead of Michelangelo, Tutor knew what they meant. The implications were staggering. For the first time in computing history, the barrier between having an idea and making it interactive was almost zero. Non-technical people could build sophisticated educational software without waiting for a programmer to translate their vision into code. On Tutor, a programmer named Bruce Artwick wrote the first version of what would become Microsoft Flight Simulator, one of the longest-running software franchises in history. The simulation ran on PLATO terminals in the mid-1970s. Students could fly over wireframe landscapes rendered on orange plasma screens. Artwick later adapted it for personal computers, and the rest is commercial history. But the origin is PLATO. The origin is Tutor, and neither appears in the credits. When the PLATO ecosystem collapsed under the weight of mainframe economics, Tutor went with it. The language had no migration path. No open-source community picked it up. No university preserved it as a living project. Its unique architecture, the answer judging system, the accessibility for non-coders, the seamless integration with networked terminals, simply ceased to exist. The documentation gathered dust. The last terminals were switched off. The community scattered. A programming language designed to put creation in the hands of ordinary people was replaced, eventually, by hypertext markup language. A language that requires you to understand tags, syntax, and hierarchy before you can make a single page. Whether Tutor could have become the foundation of the web instead of a footnote is debated among computing historians. That it deserved better than quiet extinction is not. Here is the detail about Cybersyn that keeps me awake. The software running inside that demolished room was called Cyberstride. It was written in a programming language called Dynamo, developed at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And it did something that Silicon Valley would not commercialize for another 4 decades. Cyberstride monitored production data flowing in from Chilean factories via telex. It applied Bayesian statistical models to identify bottlenecks. Not after they caused problems, but before. The system flagged anomalies 24 hours before the alert reached the central command. And here is the part that separates Cyberstride from every surveillance tool built since. The early warning went to the workers on the factory floor first. Not to the president, not to the military. To the people closest to the problem, giving them time to fix it themselves before anyone in Santiago even knew something was wrong. Compare this to what Glushkov proposed for the Soviet Union, a top-down system where data flowed upward to central planners. Beer designed the opposite. The intelligence moved outward before it moved upward. He wrote in Brain of the Firm that if you build a system that only controls from the top, you have not built intelligence. You have built a cage. The mainframe that ran Cyberstride was an International Business Machines 360/50. After the coup, the data was not archived. The telex logs were not preserved. The Bayesian models were not published. Raúl Espejo, a Chilean engineer who worked alongside Beer and who would later become a leading cybernetician in his own right, documented what survived in Cybernetics of Governance. But the working system, the running code, the living proof that a small country could be governed by anticipation rather than reaction, all of it was wiped clean from the machines it ran on. No backups were made. No foreign university requested a copy. No archive preserved the algorithms. The data did not decay, it was erased. Predictive Analytics for National Governance, 1971. And we act as if Amazon invented the concept when it started recommending books in 1998. The last attempt came from the place where the first had failed. In the 1980s, the Soviet Academy of Sciences launched Akademset, a fiber optic and satellite network designed to connect research institutions across the Eastern Bloc. The project was managed by VNIIPAS, the All-Union Scientific Research Institute for Applied Automated Systems. Unlike OGAS and EGSVT, this was not a proposal. This was not a resolution. This was glass cable being laid in trenches, satellite dishes being bolted to rooftops, packets of data crossing borders. By 1986, a working link connected Leningrad, Moscow, and Prague. Soviet physicists could query Western databases. Mathematicians could share proofs across time zones. For the first time in the history of the Soviet scientific establishment, information moved faster than the bureaucracy that was supposed to control it. The Soviet security services were horrified. An open network meant uncontrolled information. It meant researchers could read what the state had not approved. It meant the border between Soviet knowledge and Western knowledge would blur, and with it, the entire justification for information control that had sustained the security apparatus for decades. Internal memos from the period reflect growing alarm. The network was not just a technical achievement, it was a political threat wrapped in fiber optics. And then, in 1991, the country that built the network ceased to exist. The Soviet Union dissolved on Christmas Day, and Akademset, that working, functional, pulsing fiber optic backbone, was carved up and sold. Privatized in pieces to the highest bidder. Sections of the infrastructure became the skeleton of early Russian internet service providers, stripped of their scientific purpose and repurposed for commerce. The unified network that could have connected every university in a sixth of the world's landmass was auctioned off like furniture from a bankrupt estate. 3 attempts. OGAS in the 60s, killed by a finance ministry that feared transparency. EGSVT in the 70s, eaten alive by rival bureaucracies building incompatible fiefdoms. Akademset in the 80s, a functioning fiber optic backbone sold for scrap when the country beneath it dissolved. Each one more technically mature than the last, each one destroyed by a different organ of the same dying body. And here is the connection that ties the Soviet failures to the Chilean ones, the detail that crystallized only after I laid all 10 cases side by side. Glushkov designed a system where data flowed upward to serve the planners. Beer designed one where data flowed outward to serve the workers. Opposite philosophies, opposite architectures, identical outcome, destruction. The direction of the data did not matter. What mattered was that someone, somewhere, would lose control. And that was unacceptable regardless of ideology. 10 systems, 3 continents, 3 decades, every one of them functional, every one of them destroyed, not by failure, but by the specific kind of success that threatens the people holding the levers. The ops room was demolished because it worked during the strike. OGAS was buried because it would have shown where the money was actually going. PLATO was abandoned because the future it offered was locked inside hardware the market refused to subsidize. Talkomatic was censured because students preferred talking to studying. And Academ Set was auctioned because the state that owned the cables stopped existing before the cables could carry their weight. The convenient version of history says Silicon Valley invented the digital world, that a handful of garages in California sometime in the 1970s and 80s gave birth to everything we now take for granted. The truth is messier and more painful. The internet, electronic payments, real-time chat, predictive analytics, touchscreens, democratic feedback systems, networked audio synthesis, and programming languages designed for non-programmers. Every single one of these existed before the Silicon boom. They existed in Kiev, in Santiago, in Urbana-Champaign, in Prague. They were built by people whose names do not appear on any stock exchange. Most people hear the word innovation and picture a garage in Palo Alto. You just heard 10 stories that say otherwise. You followed the thread from Moscow to Santiago to Illinois and back, and you saw the same pattern repeating. Build something that works, watch it threaten someone's position, watch it get dismantled. That pattern did not end in the 20th century. It is running right now, in industries you interact with daily, and the only difference is that the demolition is quieter. If one of these erased systems unsettled you more than the others, if OGAS or Cybersyn or the orange glow of a PLATO screen stuck in your head, drop it in the comments and make the case for why that one mattered most. Strongest argument gets pinned. Subscribe if the future interests you as much as the past. Because next time, we go deeper, into the machines that were not just forgotten, but classified.